I'm 104 years old. Most of the people who once filled my life are already gone. When you live this long, you outlast almost everything you once believed was permanent. Your parents go first, then friends, then the neighbors whose faces you used to see every morning. Even the world itself begins to feel unfamiliar. People think the hardest part of old age is pain or sickness. It isn't. The hardest part is realizing how much of the support you thought would always be there slowly disappears. I didn't understand that when I was younger, not even when I turned 70. Back then, I still believed what most people believe, that family and friends would somehow hold everything together in the later years. But life doesn't unfold that way. By the time you reach your 70s, the only support you can truly rely on isn't family or friends. It's 5 things you either built quietly over your lifetime or you didn't. I know this because I've watched what happens to people who reach old age without them. And I've lived long enough to see the difference. The first pillar is your body. Not strength the way young people think about it, not lifting heavy things or running fast, just the simple ability to move, to get out of bed without help, to walk across a room, to climb a few steps without holding on to someone's arm. It sounds small when you're young, but after 70, it becomes everything. I learned this lesson when I was 73. One winter morning, I woke up and tried to stand. My legs felt stiff, almost locked. For a moment, I thought something serious had happened. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, gripping the nightstand, waiting for my legs to cooperate. Eventually, they did, slowly, but the fear stayed with me. Not long before that, a woman named Clara lived 2 houses down from me. She'd stopped walking outside because her knees hurt. At first it made sense. Pain has a way of persuading you to sit still. But weeks became months. Then she stopped going to the grocery store. Then she stopped leaving the house altogether. Eventually, her daughter moved her into a small room in her home. Clara didn't lose her mind. She didn't lose her personality. She lost her legs. And when you lose your legs, you lose your choices. So I started walking every morning, not far, just around the block. Some mornings my knees complained. Some mornings the air was cold enough to sting my lungs. But I walked. At 104, my steps are slower now, but I still move through my own life. That is the first pillar. The second pillar is learning to need less. This one took me longer to understand. After my husband Thomas died, I continued living in the house we had shared for 40 years. It was a good house, 2 stories, a yard. Rooms full of furniture we had collected over decades. But the house slowly began demanding more from me than I could comfortably give. Repairs, heating bills, property taxes that rose a little every year. I was 72 when I finally sat at the kitchen table one evening and looked honestly at the numbers. The truth was simple. The life I was maintaining was larger than the life I was actually living. So I sold the house. Some people thought it was sad. A few even told me I was giving up something important. But I moved into a small place with 1 bedroom and a narrow garden. Everything I owned fit comfortably inside it. Something unexpected happened after that. I felt lighter. When you need less, the world has less leverage over you. You don't depend on others to maintain things that no longer matter. I saw the opposite happen to a man named Harold who lived nearby. Harold kept his large house long after he could afford it. Pride can be a stubborn thing. Eventually he needed help paying the bills, then help maintaining the property. Every favor he asked for seemed to take something from him. Not his dignity exactly, but something close to it. Freedom, I discovered, often hides inside simplicity. That is the second pillar. The third pillar is your health, not perfect health. Age rarely allows that, but the small habits that keep your body from collapsing under its own neglect. I had a brother named Robert who believed doctors were unnecessary. He liked to say that if something wasn't obviously broken, it didn't need attention. He reached 78 before his body began presenting the bill. Diabetes, heart trouble, blood pressure so high it frightened the doctors. Suddenly, his life revolved around medications and appointments. He didn't die quickly. Instead, he spent years managing decline. Watching that changed the way I treated my own body. Nothing dramatic. I walked, I ate simply, I slept at reasonable hours. Once a year, I allowed a doctor to examine things I preferred not to think about, small things repeated over time. At 104, my health is what you might expect for someone who has lived this long. My joints complain. My hearing isn't what it once was, but I wake each morning able to care for myself. That is a quiet form of independence, and independence becomes precious when you grow old. That is the third pillar. The fourth pillar is something most people avoid discussing: loss. After 70, loss stops being an occasional visitor. It becomes part of the landscape. Friends disappear one by one. Some move away. Some fall ill. Some simply do not wake up one morning. Oh, my husband Thomas died when I was 68. It was an ordinary afternoon. We had eaten lunch together, nothing special, just soup and bread. He wiped his hands with a napkin and sat down in his chair near the window. A few minutes later, I noticed he hadn't moved. I remember touching his shoulder and realizing with a strange calmness that something had ended. The house felt different that night, not empty exactly, just altered. For weeks afterward, I found myself listening for sounds that would never come again. His footsteps in the hallway, the creak of his chair. Grief has a way of settling into the quiet spaces of a house. I knew another widow named Margaret who lost her husband around the same time. She chose a different path after that. She stopped going to church, stopped attending the weekly dinners she used to enjoy. Gradually, she stopped leaving the house at all. Her children visited when they could, but visits cannot replace the life someone has abandoned. She began waiting for company, waiting for someone to fill the silence. But silence is stubborn. The truth about loss is simple. It doesn't ask permission. After 70, you will lose people you love. That part is unavoidable. The question is whether you continue living your own life afterward, or whether you quietly step out of it. That is the fourth pillar. The fifth pillar took me the longest to understand: knowing who you are. You might think that by the time someone reaches 70 or 80, they would already know this. But many people lose themselves gradually as they age. Children begin making decisions for them. Doctors speak about them rather than to them. Society assumes that age has erased their ability to think clearly. I watched a woman named Helen go through this slowly. First, her son convinced her to stop driving because he worried about safety. Then he suggested she move closer to his home. Then he began helping her manage small details of her life. Each step seemed reasonable on its own. But over time, Helen stopped living her own life entirely. She lived the life others had decided was appropriate for her. I made a different choice. When my daughter once suggested I move into a retirement community just to be safe, I thanked her for her concern, and then I said no, not angrily, just clearly. I told her that as long as I could wake up each morning and manage my own day, I intended to continue doing exactly that. That decision surprised her, but it preserved something important. Myself. That is the fifth pillar. Now I am 104. Most mornings I sit near the window with a cup of tea and watch the street slowly wake up. Children pass on their way to school. Cars move through the intersection at the end of the block. Sometimes a dog pauses at my fence and sniffs the garden. The world continues moving, whether you participate in it or not. Most of the people who once shared my life are gone now. Thomas has been gone for decades. Friends whose voices once filled my kitchen exist only in memory, but the 5 pillars remain. My body still carries me through the day. My life remains simple enough that I do not depend heavily on anyone else. My health, imperfect as it is, still allows me to care for myself. Loss no longer frightens me the way it once did, and I still know who I am. When you live long enough, you realize something most people discover too late. Family and friends are precious, but they walk beside you only for part of the road. The life that supports you in the end is the one you quietly build for yourself. At 104, that truth feels very clear to me, and there isn't much reason left to keep quiet about it. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you for listening to an old woman's memories. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, the kind people only share after a lifetime of living, you're welcome to stay here with me. Just subscribe, and I'll speak again soon. If any part of this story reminded you of someone in your life, tell me in the comments. At my age, hearing from people still means a lot.